Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussions of murder, violence, and trauma. Listener discretion is advised. The following story is drawn from public records, historical reporting, and community accounts. Some victim names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. Where the historical record contains gaps, certain elements have been carefully reconstructed for clarity. Legal outcomes are described as they are recorded at the time of trial. Before we go any further, it helps to understand the place this happened. Smyth County sits in the far southwestern corner of Virginia, right up against Tennessee. It's Appalachian in the truest sense. Mountains, valleys, and long stretches of road where you might not pass another car for a while. Marion is the county seat, small enough that most people recognize faces at the grocery store. Rural enough that back roads and service roads aren't unusual. They're just a part of daily life. In the late 80s, you were looking at a county of around 30,000 people, spread out across a lot of land. It wasn't isolated from the world, but it wasn't fast-paced either. News traveled by word of mouth, as much as it did by newspaper. And when something serious happened, it didn't just affect one neighborhood, it rippled through the whole area. This wasn't a place unfamiliar with tragedy. People still remembered 1984. They remembered Lim Tuggle. They remembered the escape. You just don't erase something like that. But time does what time does. It settles things. Life moves forward. People go back to work. Kids go back to school. Clerks still work alone on night shifts because that's how it has always been done. Back in the 80s, Smyth County felt steady again. Not untouched, not naive, but steady. You locked your doors if you thought about it. Sometimes you didn't. It wasn't reckless. It was routine. When you grow up around here, you learn pretty early what feels normal and what doesn't. Not in some dramatic way. It's just instinct. You know when a car doesn't belong. You notice when a porch light stays on longer than usual. You pay attention to little things because in a small place, little things are usually all you have to go on. And then, over the course of a few months, that feeling started to slip. Not all at once, just enough that people began to notice. At first, nobody was saying anything out loud. They rarely do. Around here, fear doesn't come with sirens. It shows up quietly, in the way routines change before people admit why they're changing. In 1989, some women in this county reported encounters with the same man. What happened during those encounters would leave a lasting mark on this community. At that point, most people still didn't know his name. This story isn't just about murders. It isn't just about court records or sentencing. It's about the long road that led there, and how someone who grew up in the same place would later be convicted in 2 states and investigated in connection with violence that touched Smyth County. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the real Appalachia. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. The man in this story wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone who had just moved into the neighborhood. He was born here, in the same town many of us trace our roots back to, one way or another. Mainly because that's where the hospital is. Same roads, same hills, same places where everybody's story overlaps, whether they realize it or not. If you had passed him at the grocery store, or seen him pumping gas, or standing in line somewhere, nothing about him would have stood out. That's not hindsight talking. That's what people said at the time. He didn't act unusual, didn't dress unusual, didn't carry himself in a way that raised alarms. After high school, he did what a lot of young men around here did, especially back then. He left, joined the Marines, and was stationed in North Carolina at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point. He had structure, wore a uniform, earned a paycheck, and for a while, from the outside looking in, it may have appeared to be a clean break. the kind of path that suggests direction and stability. But in 1986, while he was still serving in the Marines, that image fractured. Inside the barracks, he assaulted a fellow Marine at knife point. He was arrested, later convicted in connection with that assault, dishonorably discharged, and sentenced to prison in North Carolina. For many, that might feel like the point where this story should have ended. There was accountability. There was consequences. There was a prison sentence. But it didn't end there. He served roughly 3 years and was released in 1988. He returned to Marion, Virginia, back to the same county where most people were unaware of the details of his prior conviction. He found work and resumed daily life in a way, on the surface, that appeared ordinary. He later moved between Virginia and North Carolina for employment. And that is where this story takes a turn, because while Smyth County was going about its business, something had already gone wrong somewhere else. In February of 1989, down in North Carolina, a young woman, I'm calling her Sarah Dalton, was attacked in her home. She was 26 years old, a mother, working, living a normal life. According to investigators, someone broke in, assaulted her, cut her throat, and shot her, all while her 2-year-old child was still inside the house. At the time, police didn't know who was responsible. It appeared, at least on the surface, to be random, the kind of killing that unsettles a community. April 15th, 1989. In the early morning hours, that time of day when most of the county is asleep, and the roads are quiet but not empty, a young woman, 20 years old, was trying to get home. She was a former student. She knew people around town, and she accepted a ride from someone she didn't have any immediate reason to fear. She later told investigators he said he'd take her home. Instead, the car passed by her house, out beyond the lights, away from where anyone would notice. What happened next, she reported, was violent and deliberate. She said she was beaten and assaulted, and when it was over, she was left there, badly hurt, with no way to know she'd be able to get up again. But she did. Injured and bleeding, she made her way to the Marion Police Department. She walked through the front door and told officers what had happened. She gave a description of the suspect and the car he was driving, and walked them through it step by step. But at that point, they still didn't have a name to put with it. If that had just been the end of it, this story might have stopped right there. A brutal crime, and a survivor who made it home. But nothing was solved yet, because there was no name, and whoever was responsible was still out there. Among the details she gave investigators was a description of the car he was driving. Later, investigators located a vehicle matching that description and ran the registration. It was registered to a woman I'll call Linda K. Harper. Linda had gone out that evening to a dance, the wagon wheel, or hog stomp as some around here called it. This was at the local fire department, something that had been part of life around here for decades. If you've ever been to one of those, you know what I mean. Folding chairs along the wall, music that's just loud enough to talk over if you lean in close, people you've known your whole life standing around catching up on who's sick, who's moved, and who just had a grandbaby. It wasn't risky, it wasn't unusual, it was normal. And Linda was normal in the best way. She wasn't somebody who disappeared. She wasn't secretive or unpredictable. The people who knew her described her as dependable. If she said she was going somewhere, she went. If she said she'd be home, she came home. That's the rhythm people remember about her, not the headlines. So when she didn't show up the next morning, it didn't take long before something felt off. There's something about small towns that people from bigger places don't always understand. It isn't just that everybody knows everybody. It's that you know their patterns. You know what they drive. You know where they work. You know who always leaves the porch light on and who doesn't. Life runs on routine. And when that routine changes, even in a small way, people notice. The next morning, Linda's body was discovered along a rural road. Investigators quickly determined her death was a result of violence, and it shook people here in a way that's hard to explain unless you live through it. It wasn't ruled an accident. It wasn't ruled something that could be brushed aside with an easy explanation. And that's what unsettled people the most. Because if something like that could happen after something as ordinary as a fire hall dance, then suddenly the ordinary didn't feel quite as solid as it used to. The local theories began to circulate. Maybe she had left with the wrong person. Maybe it was someone passing through. Maybe it was personal, and people just didn't know the whole backstory yet. Not because anyone was trying to excuse it. That's just how people try to make sense of something like this. If you can put a boundary around it, tell yourself it was isolated, or specific, or tied to one situation, it feels a little more manageable. Not less tragic, never that. Just easier to believe it won't happen again tomorrow. But underneath those conversations was something else. A realization that maybe this wasn't random. Maybe it wasn't isolated. And maybe it wasn't finished. In a county this size, one murder is enough to change how people sleep at night. One is enough to make folks double check the locks. Leave the porch light on a little longer. Maybe call somebody to say, "Hey, let me know when you get home." And nobody wanted to think about what that would mean if there was going to be another. By then, whether people were saying it out loud or not, something had changed. Conversations lasted a little longer. Parents paid closer attention to their children. People walked each other to their cars at night when they might not have bothered before. Nobody was using the word pattern yet, but something felt off. Not dangerous exactly, just unsettled. Like the normal explanations weren't fitting as neatly as they should. Then July came, and whatever distance people had managed to keep from the earlier violence began to disappear. July 5th, 1989. We'll call her Donna Mercer. She was working the night shift at the Adwell Food Center, just outside Marion. If you grew up in Appalachia, you already know the kind of place I'm talking about. Not a big chain store, not bright and polished, just a small convenience store where you run in for milk, bread, or a soda on the way home. The kind of place where you don't even have to look at the sign because you've been stopping there your whole life. And the person behind the counter usually knows you by name. And that was Donna. She wasn't just a clerk. She was somebody you talked to. Somebody who remembered what brand of cigarettes you bought, asked how your kids were doing, or had your change counted out before you even finished digging through your wallet. Little things, but that's what sticks with people. Not the headlines, not the police reports, just those small everyday exchanges. She had worked there long enough that her routine was basically part of everyone else's routine. So, when customers came in that night and the lights were on, but Donna wasn't behind the counter, it didn't feel dramatic at first. It just felt like something was wrong. The register drawer was open. The door wasn't locked. Everything looked like she'd just stepped away for a second. But Donna wouldn't have just stepped away. Not like that. If she had run to the back, she'd told someone. If she'd closed early, she'd have made sure folks knew about it. She just didn't disappear mid-shift. And around here, that kind of routine matters. When it breaks, people notice. Not long after, the police were called. At first, it was just a welfare check. A clerk not at the counter. Lights on. Drawer open. Something that didn't add up. Officers came out, walked through the store, and looked around. No signs of a struggle inside. No overturned shelves. Nothing that screamed chaos. But Donna wasn't there. Before investigators even had time to process what they were dealing with at the convenience store, another call had already gone out that same night. Rescue crews were dispatched to the home of a Marion man for a reported gunshot wound. A man had shot himself in the shoulder. He was transported to the local hospital. The injury wasn't life-threatening. He hadn't lost much blood. It was logged as an apparent suicide attempt. Back at the convenience store, the deputy started checking the surrounding roads. There's a service road that runs parallel with Interstate 81, a dead-end road, not far from the store. The kind of road most people drive past without ever thinking about it. A few hours later, that's where they found her. She'd been brutally attacked and killed. It became clear very quickly to investigators that this was not an accident. It wasn't something that could easily be explained away. By the time word spread the next morning, the feeling in the county had shifted. Linda's murder had unsettled people. Donna's did something different. It made it personal. Because almost everybody had spoken to Donna at some point. Almost everybody had stood at that counter, which meant almost everybody could picture exactly where she'd been standing when her night was cut short. And that's what made it heavier. And for a while, People tried to make sense of it the only way they knew how. It wasn't some distant place or some unusual circumstance. It was a normal Wednesday night at a store you'd probably been in that same week. In the days that followed, investigators began with those closest to Donna. That's not unusual. In cases like this, law enforcement often starts by examining domestic relationships and recent conflicts. Donna had an estranged husband. There had been documented tension and financial disputes between them, issues that investigators would naturally view as part of the process. After questioning him, and as the investigation continued, he was arrested roughly a month later and charged with capital murder. And for a while, that explanation made sense to people. Not because it felt good, it didn't, but because it felt contained. It meant this wasn't someone drifting through the county. It wasn't random. It wasn't something you had to look over your shoulder about at the gas pump or in a parking lot. It was tragic. It was ugly, but it was explainable. And explainable feels safer than the unknown. And for a few weeks, people exhaled, just a little. Quietly. Nobody celebrated. Nobody acted like anything was fixed. But there was a sense that maybe this had limits. Maybe it wasn't bigger than it first appeared. And in a small place, that kind of fragile relief doesn't last long. People started paying attention in ways they hadn't before. Clerks didn't like closing alone. If someone worked late, they'd ask a friend to hang around until they locked the door. Parents called their kids in a little earlier at night. If your car broke down, somebody stayed with you instead of just dropping you off and heading home. Nobody called it fear. Nobody said that word out loud. It was more like caution, like the whole county had turned the volume up just a notch on everything around them. You'd walk into a store, you'd notice who else was in there. You'd see a strange car parked somewhere and wonder who it was. If someone was late getting home, you didn't just shrug it off anymore. You picked up the phone. Those aren't big changes, but when you add them all together, they tell you something. They tell you people didn't feel safe as they used to. And the hardest part was that there wasn't anything concrete to point to. No alert system, no updates every hour. This was 1989. If you wanted news, you got it from the evening broadcast or from whoever happened to hear from something before you did. Most of the time, all you had was rumor. And as you know, rumors feed off fear. Somebody thought they saw something on a back road. Somebody swore they heard something from another county over about another attack. Most of it wasn't true, but that didn't matter, because once your mind starts connecting dots, it doesn't take much to keep you up at night. Looking back now, a lot of folks describe that summer the same way. Not chaotic, not panicked, just heavy, like something hanging in the air that nobody could quite name yet. Because even though a man had been arrested and was sitting in jail charged with Donna's murder, somewhere in the back of their minds, people knew the story didn't feel finished. They just didn't know how unfinished it really was, because Linda K. Harper's murder remained unsolved. There was still no one charged in her case. Then, on October 13th of that same year, another woman reported being attacked, and this time, the investigation took a turn. She was an employee of the U.S. Forest Service. Her office was in a semi-remote part of the county, carrying out her job in the middle of the day. This wasn't a dark parking lot or a late-night shift. It was broad daylight, in a place people considered quiet and safe. According to court records, she was attacked, abducted, assaulted, and stabbed, and left in the woods. But she survived. Because she survived, she was able to speak with investigators and describe what had happened. And she identified the man she said attacked her as Michael Reeves. That was the first time his name appeared in a formal warrant, but he wasn't in custody just yet. And in the days surrounding that attack, reports of violence continued. 4 days later, a motel clerk in Bristol, Tennessee, about 30 miles away, reported being abducted and raped at knife point. Not long after that, a woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, reported being forced into a vehicle, taken to a motel, bound, assaulted, and left behind. Different towns, same week. Investigators began comparing descriptions and methods across state lines. According to law enforcement, the similarities were significant, and Reeves emerged as a primary suspect in those cases. Once the Forest Service employee identified him, warrants were issued, and as officers began looking for him, he didn't turn himself in. He was eventually located, and on October 19, 1989, officers attempted to stop his vehicle. He fled and led them on a pursuit, driving down a Forest Service road. Deputies moved in from the opposite direction. With some doubt now in the minds of authorities, and as additional evidence developed, Donna's estranged husband was cleared of any involvement in her death, and after 102 days of incarceration, he was released. Up until that point, the county had been reacting, always one step behind, trying to make sense of what had already happened. But now, investigators had something concrete to work with. They had a name connected to the attack. They had a face. They had someone they could place in a lineup and ask, "Is that him?" As detectives examined his background, North Carolina investigators began making their own inquiries. According to law enforcement, the details emerging from Smyth County bore similarities to cases they had been investigating earlier that year. Authorities later tested a firearm connected to Reeves. Investigators stated that ballistic analysis linked that weapon to the shooting of Sarah Dalton in North Carolina. For investigators, what had once seemed like separate cases began to take on the appearance of a possible pattern. He was no longer being viewed as connected to a single incident. Law enforcement began examining whether the same suspect could be responsible for violence across multiple jurisdictions. That's when the language shifted. Incident became pattern, at least in the eyes of the investigators. And as the legal process began, it moved slowly. Paperwork, motions, continuances, dates that get set and pushed back and set again. If you've ever sat through a criminal trial, you know it doesn't feel like television. It's fluorescent lights and hard benches, and a lot of waiting around while lawyers talk about things most people in the room can barely understand. But for the people directly involved, every one of those days feels heavy. Because you're not there to watch a show. You're there because the worst thing that ever happened to you is about to be picked apart in front of strangers. The first trial took place in Virginia, centered on the attack of the Forest Service worker, the woman he abducted, assaulted, and left in the woods. She survived, and that meant she had to sit in that courtroom, just a few feet away from him, and tell 12 strangers exactly what happened. Not summarize it, not soften it, tell it out loud. People sometimes gloss over that part when they talk about cases like this, but it takes a kind of strength most of us hope we never have to discover. Walking into a courtroom, seeing the person who hurt you, pointing at him, saying, "That's him." Doing it because if you don't, he might walk out the door. Once she testified, much of the uncertainty in that case fell away. The physical evidence aligned with her account. The timeline supported it. Her identification was clear. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty on all accounts: attempted murder, kidnapping, assault. The court imposed consecutive sentences, 2 life terms, plus an additional 100 years. Not symbolic, practical. The legal system's way of saying, you're never walking out of here. A few months later, he stood trial again. this time for the April assault involving the young woman who had managed to make her way back to the Marion Police Department after her attack. She testified as well. Same process, the same defendant seated at the defense table. And you think about what it must have felt like, having to relive something like that in public, with a courtroom full of people watching, knowing your story is going to be questioned from every angle. But she did it. She identified him and told the jury what had happened. She also described the car he was driving that night. Investigators later located a vehicle matching that description parked near the Marion Police Department, and it was registered to Linda K. Harper. Linda's body had been found the following day after the dance at the fire hall. During her testimony, the assault victim linked Reeves to that vehicle, a connection that brought Linda's unsolved homicide back into focus. The jury convicted Reeves of the sexual assault charges, but no charges were filed in Linda K. Harper's murder. By that point, Reeves had accumulated so much time that it almost stopped meaning anything. Life plus decades. Numbers stacked so high they didn't even sound real anymore. But the message was clear. As far as Virginia was concerned, he was never coming back to live freely in Smyth County again. In North Carolina, they had something waiting for him too. Instead of putting everyone through a long, drawn-out trial for the North Carolina murder of Sarah Dalton, Reeves eventually pleaded guilty. No weeks of testimony, no spectacle, just an admission. And the judge there sentenced him to death. That's how he ended up on death row, not here in Virginia, but down in Raleigh, North Carolina, waiting on an execution date that kept getting pushed further and further out. And just like that, the legal side of it was mostly finished, at least on paper. Virginia stacked life sentences on top of life sentences, enough time that he was never walking out a prison door again. North Carolina went a step further and put him on death row for Sarah Dalton's murder, which meant, legally speaking, the system had done everything it could do. But if you talk to families, or if you talk to people who lived through that year, you find out pretty quick that court outcomes and closure aren't always the same thing. Because while Reeves was convicted for the assaults in the North Carolina murder, the two women here in Smyth County, Linda Harper and Donna Mercer, never got their own trials. Not really. Virginia charged him at one point, and investigators kept working the cases. But once North Carolina secured the death sentence, the governors of both states worked out an agreement. The thinking was simple and practical. If he's already facing execution, there isn't much sense in dragging everyone through another courtroom process that wouldn't change the end result. From a legal standpoint, that made sense. But from a human standpoint, it's harder. Because families don't think in terms of efficiency. They think in terms of hearing someone say the name out loud in a courtroom and watching a jury come back with a verdict that's theirs. And when that doesn't happen, it can feel like something's unfinished, even if many people believe they knew who was responsible. Years later, advances in DNA testing led investigators to re-examine evidence connected to both murders. According to reports, newer forensic analysis reportedly indicated a link to Reeves. Many investigators had long suspected his involvement. The forensic testing strengthened that belief, though the Smyth County case was never brought to trial. But by that point, he was already locked away out of state, sitting on death row, and tied up in appeals that seemed to stretch on and on forever. So those cases here in Smyth County stayed technically open. Not solved, just unresolved, and there's a difference. As of this recording, Reeves remains alive and on death row in North Carolina. Executions there have been tied up in the courts for years, so he's been sitting longer than anyone probably expected back then when this first happened. More than 3 decades is a long time. Long enough for kids to grow up. Long enough for businesses to change hands. Long enough for a new generation to hear these names and think of them as history instead of something that happened last week. But for the people who were here in 1989, it doesn't feel that distant. Because when something like this happens in a place as small as Smyth County, it just doesn't live in a file cabinet somewhere. It lives in a memory. People still remember where they were when they heard about Linda. They remember the night that Donna didn't come home. They remember the rumors. the wrong arrest, the confusion. And then the relief of knowing the man investigators believed were connected to the violence was no longer walking around town. It wasn't dramatic relief. Nobody threw parties. It was just a quiet exhale, the kind you don't even realize you've been holding. And that's how it usually works around here. We don't make speeches. We don't build monuments. We just keep going. Stores open up the next morning. People clock in. Kids get on the bus. Life moves forward, even when something heavy is still sitting in the background, because that's what mountain towns do. They carry things quietly. When you look back on a story like this, it's easy to focus on the man at the center of it, to turn him into the headline. But that's never really been what this show is about. It's about the people who had to live through it, the clerks who still work late shifts, the families who still drive those same back roads, the ones who remember 1989 like it wasn't that long ago. Because even after all these years, something had changed. Not panic, not paranoia, just a quiet understanding. The understanding that even in a place that feels steady, even in the far southwestern corner of Virginia, nothing is completely immune. Life moved forward. It always does. But what happened that year didn't vanish. It just became a part of this place, part of its memory, part of its shadow. This has been Roots and Shadows, the real Appalachia, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one.